Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics. My name is Braden Bangelin, and I'm a senior studying international politics and data science here at the University of Kansas. In addition, I'm very proud to serve at the Institute's discussion group coordinator, my second year in this position, and a four-year member of the Dole Institute Student Advisory Board. Moreover, the Dole Institute Student Advisory Board offers many opportunities for our students here at KU. This past October, senior student workers and members of the SAB participated in a fully funded trip to Washington, D.C., where we were able to meet with various policy centers in D.C. The Student Advisory Board is a bipartisan group whose members can access many great opportunities through their involvement with the Institute, including volunteering, networking with guests, and professional development opportunities. If you are a student and would like to join the Student Advisory Board, please speak with a student worker, such as myself, after the program. A loop hearing system is available to use if you have a T-coil hearing aid. We also have a limited number of listening devices. If you have questions about the loop system, or if at any time during the program you have difficulty hearing, please alert one of our staff members. After the program, we will have some time for the audience to ask questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand, and a student worker with a microphone will come to you. Please stand if you are able, and just ask one brief question. If you are part of our virtual audience today, you may submit your questions at dolequestions@ku.edu. The Dole Institute's mission is to foster civil and respectful discussion around important and often difficult topics. Please phrase your question with this in mind. Before we begin, lastly, I'd like to remind you all to please turn off your cell phones for this event. Now please join me in welcoming Dole Fellow Mr. Beat.
They said I could just stay seated, so I'm going to do that. I'm just going to stay seated here. So thank you for being here. Like Braden said, my name is Matt Beat, known on the internet as Mr. Beat. This is the microphone. Make sure we can hear. How's that sound? Okay, better. Okay. My name is Matt Beat, known on the internet as Mr. Beat, and this is the fourth program of a five-part series looking at the power of the presidency. And this is kind of a unique program because this time we're looking at how the states limit the power of the presidency. Before I introduce my special guest, I do have a little introduction I wrote up here just to kind of frame this. So, yeah, in previous weeks we looked at how Congress and the courts limit the power of the president. But, you know, they're still arguably one of the most powerful people in the world, one of the most powerful human beings on the planet. And there are more than, I think, what we think. I mean, a lot of people are worried right now, like, oh, there seems to be not many constraints on the presidency. I hope that you walk away from this feeling a little bit more reassured that there are actually probably more limits than you realize. And specifically today, we're looking at how the states prevent the president from not doing just whatever the heck they want. So specifically, we're talking about federalism, or the system of government in which power is divided between the federal government and state and local governments. Today, we focus on the relationship the president has with the 50 states, and don't forget the 5 U.S. territories. That's not even including all the non-incorporated territories, but I digress. So yeah, 50 states. I got this idea when I was trying to fall asleep last night, an analogy, and so I haven't even told anyone yet this, so this might be a horrible metaphor, but think of it like this, like, you know, you're a parent. Raise your hand if you're a parent, like if you have, yeah, okay, so you have kids, so you establish rules for your kids, and they have to follow those rules, but then, okay, at some point, your kids grow up, they become adults, they have kids of their own. So my analogy here is like, think of the federal government as the parent, but then the kids, when they grow up, they have their own kids, and they make rules of their own. So in this case, we're talking about a parent having 50 kids, and each one of these 50 kids grows up and has kids of their own, that they have all these different rules. We don't think of this, I think, enough, the fact that every single state has different rules. In the early years of the Republic, we were a loose that was a horrible analogy, wasn't it? No. Okay, you could tell me later. Okay, anyway, back to the script. In the early years of the Republic, we were a loose confederation of states, held together by a shared hatred of British imperial rule and taxation. Our first constitution with a lowercase c, the Articles of Confederation. It didn't even give Congress the power to raise money. And so a few years later, a new constitution replaced it with a capital C, the constitution we still have today, and I would say the vast majority of Americans still love today. Jump ahead to the presidency of Andrew Jackson, and South Carolina's state legislature was like, no, we don't need to follow a federal law if we don't agree with it. And then President Jackson intervened, put a stop to that real quick. So that was the first major struggle we'll see that we'll look at. But the president's power of the states further expanded after that, perhaps ironically, when half of the states broke away from our own country to form their own country, and what we call today simply the Civil War. You may have heard of that one. We survived as a nation that horrible bloody war, but dual federalism remained. Basically the idea that power is split between state governments and the federal government. Dual federalism is the term for that. Beginning in the early 1900s, that began to change, especially regarding the Commerce Clause. The federal government increasingly got involved in interstate commerce and protecting individual rights from state government abuse. By the end of FDR's New Deal and World War II, more Americans than ever felt more loyalty to their federal government. Instead of calling themselves, I'm a Kansan or I'm a Virginian, I'm an American. This is actually a relatively new thing. And there was more loyalty to the federal government as opposed to their state and local governments. This trend, of course, has not reversed ever since World War II. So what about the president's role in all of this? Well, again, in today's program, we'll specifically look at the presidencies of Andrew Jackson, Abraham Lincoln, Theodore Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, and Lyndon Johnson with regards to how federalism just ain't what it once was. We'll also look at Reagan a little bit if we have time, and Nixon. In recent years, we now have what we call new federalism. I hate people that do the air quotes, but I'm one of those people, so I'm sorry about that. But yeah, new federalism is a movement inspired by, like I said, more recent presidents like Ronald Reagan, and even going back to Richard Nixon, that called for a return of powers to the states. So in this program, let's look at how the presidents have not only been limited by state powers, but also how they've influenced how the rest of us view federalism. So it's time for me to introduce my special guest. André Dutra is a Brazilian-American history YouTuber based out of the Miami area who makes high-quality educational videos about American political history with a special emphasis on American presidents. Heck yeah. So it's no wonder that we connected on YouTube. He has earned a bachelor's degree in political science and communication studies from Florida Atlantic University. In many ways, he reminds me of myself when I was younger, except that he is smarter and a much better storyteller than I was at his age. While you can find him on TikTok and Instagram, his YouTube channel is the main place you can find his wonderful videos. It has around 22,000 subscribers and rising and nearly 2 million views, making him one of the rising stars in political history online. Please give a warm welcome to my friend, André Dutra.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction.
Sure. And I meant every word of it. So this first question is just a softball, because we're seriously, if you go on YouTube and you just search any video about presidents, chances are you're going to come across one of our videos in the search results. So yeah, just who's your favorite president and why? Let's just get that out of the way.
Well, my favorite president is George Washington, and your videos actually played a really huge influence on my thinking on that. I think that it's important to consider the world in which the presidency came into existence, right? Most countries had all-powerful monarchies that were hereditary. The idea of choosing a leader democratically was this new radical idea, especially on a federal level. So Suddenly, here's this new republic, and they choose George Washington, this venerated military general, and he takes power. And the Constitution actually doesn't lay out very specifically what the role of the presidency is going to be. It's a lot clearer on what the president can't do, but what the role of the presidency is going to be exactly, there just isn't too much written. So a lot of the presidency ends up being built on around Washington's own personal set of skills. And so much of the presidency that we have still to this day remains based off of that specific framework. I think that if you look at Washington, he governed with a certain amount of restraint and pragmatism that other presidents who were very great in their own right might not have had. You know, Washington's decision to step away from absolute power, to not seek a third term, and to set the precedent of only serving 2 terms at a time that would only be broken by Franklin Roosevelt in the 1940s is a really extraordinary one. And you know, so much of what makes the presidency so special is its ability to change. And even our government overall, just the ability to evolve has played such a large part of it in this country's development. And that's a lot of what we're going to talk about here tonight.
The Cincinnatus of the Americas, yeah. My favorite president, too, in case you didn't know. I know they were dying to know. Okay, but yeah, let's talk about federalism. So the whole idea of federalism comes from the 10th Amendment, so we'll just start there with the Constitution itself. So what does the 10th Amendment say?
So the 10th Amendment states that any powers that weren't specifically assigned to the federal government or prohibited to the states are then given to the states or to the people. What this means basically is that the scope of the federal government is very, very limited, and that the state governments are going to be the primary actors in the daily lives of its citizens. Now, what happened over time is that as the country became larger, more complex, and the states began relying on each other more, the lines between these really became blurred, and the federal government started expanding its power a bit into the realm of the states, and that's where you get to the cooperative federalism that we see today.
Yep. So we'll get to that, but I mean, let's just kind of, just generally speaking today, what are there's a long list, but what major policies and laws come to mind immediately that are left to the states?
Yeah, so when you think of the powers that are left up to the states, it's really the things that impact people's daily lives, like hospitals, schools, law enforcement, even implementation of larger federal programs like Medicaid and Social Security really vary significantly on a state-by-state basis.
So stuff doesn't matter, yeah. No, yeah, that's the thing, I don't think we think about this enough. I mean, our day-to-day lives, a lot of this stuff is local and state, and yet so much attention is on the federal government in terms of media. So yeah, I'm glad we're doing this program. So yeah, we mentioned schools, law enforcement, actual implementation of welfare programs. So then we talk about, okay, that's not even including the state governors, the state courts, and the state legislatures. So how about them specifically? How do they reduce the power of the government?
So state governors, legislatures, and courts can reduce the power of the presidency in a couple very significant ways. Number one is interpretation. While obviously the executive branch is the branch of government that's responsible for the implementation and enforcement of laws, it's really in the states where you see the implementation come to fruition. So let's say, for example, if a state governor disagrees with a president's executive order on a specific policy, they don't necessarily have to comply with that. A lot of times, even though the federal government has significant resources, they rely on state infrastructure and personnel for implementation of those laws. Another really big way that states can alter the power of or can limit the power of the presidency is through litigation. Very often, you can see states suing the federal government over laws or executive orders that they find to be unconstitutional. Some recent examples of that could even be Obamacare, Biden's attempt to forgive student loan debt, or even Trump's travel ban from the first administration.
Yep. West Virginia suing the EPA and winning that case a couple years ago. That was a big one. Mm-hmm. So states can dissent by pursuing their own public own policy platform contrary to that of the national government. I think another example that's kind of fresh on our minds is COVID, the individual lockdown policies. Just like this is something we talked about earlier, but in Florida, how strict were they in Florida with lockdown policies?
I think for the first few weeks of the pandemic, it was pretty strict, but after that, there was a very quick return to normal, and following that initial phase of COVID in March, I think that pretty much everything was open afterwards.
And that was not like most of the other states. Like here in Kansas, I think we were even stricter during the pandemic. So one example there. So the administrative state stepping in with regulations at moments when the profit motive doesn't align with the common good. You mentioned the Clean Water Act. Like that's probably a good example. So, you know, there's the federal law, the Clean Water Act. The EPA has to enforce this, but what's the state's role in that?
Yeah, so as we established previously, the states are in charge of the general welfare of their citizens, but sometimes the government has to step in to ensure that every state is looking out for the interests of their citizens equally. So when you get something like the Clean Water Act, where the federal government sets a standard for every state to follow, that standard is going to vary a lot depending on the conditions of the actual state. You know, water quality in Florida is going to be very different from looking at water quality in Nevada, just given their own individual circumstances. So that's why the states are so important, because even when it is federal policy, a federal directive, the state implementation ends up being the determining factor in people's lives.
Yeah, water does taste different places for various reasons. Geography is a big reason, but and then, okay, we got to mention the anti-commandeering doctrine. Did I even say that correctly? Anti-commandeering. What's that about?
So the anti-commandeering doctrine, what that states is that the federal government cannot simply order the state governments to do any specific thing. They're two distinct entities. That just doesn't work like that. But what happens very often is that the federal government, with its considerable federal resources, can use those resources to try to persuade the states to act in a manner within their interests. Now, this could be a little forceful sometimes, you know.
Yeah.
Sometimes they could threaten to withhold some important aid, but it's not technically forcing them to do it in a way that would violate the Constitution.
I mean, that's another huge thing. The fact that state governments can't just create money and the federal government can, that's quite the distinction. So there are those constraints, and I think that's one reason why the federal government their role has gotten so big over the past 100, 150 years.
That's another thing, actually, because federal governments tend to be a lot less pragmatic than state governments. Someone in Congress can filibuster or spend time debating ideology and policies and all these specific things. But once you get down to the state level, they actually have to make the decisions that impact people's lives, right? You have to decide how much funding the school's going to get, how much funding the hospital's going to get. You can't just let those things get stuck in committee because people are going to get upset, you know. I'm sure you guys know that state officials are a lot more, have to respond a lot more to their communities than federal officials do. So that's just another way that they're held more accountable and why they serve that bigger role.
Absolutely. Okay, well, let's start looking at specific presidents. I mean, the current one who's on the screen right now, he'll come up at the end here. I'm sure you're probably in Q&A as well, but we're going back to, so these five in particular, I think, demonstrate how the states have had a long battle with the presidential power. So beginning with Andrew Jackson, how did Andrew Jackson shift the power from the states to the federal government?
Well, Andrew Jackson is a fascinating case, actually, because he's really continuing the legacy of Thomas Jefferson, right? Jeffersonian democracy, this picture of the United States as this agrarian utopia for farmers who could just determine their own lives. So Andrew Jackson, despite being a very big states' rights person, comes in and significantly expands the power of the federal government in a couple important ways. So the first example of this, and the most important by far, is through the nullification crisis. So to understand the nullification crisis, we'll have to go back a little bit. The Supremacy Clause of the Constitution states that when federal and state laws are in conflict with one another, the federal law takes precedent over the state law. Now, this hadn't necessarily been put to the test yet. So with the nullification crisis, you get South Carolina, which seeks to nullify a federal tariff that they feel is having an unfair impact on their state. So they just want to ignore the federal laws, what the federal government is saying. And Andrew Jackson, despite being a states' rights person himself, sees that this could set a very dangerous precedent. Mm-hmm. And what he does is he actually raises troops against South Carolina to intimidate them into dropping their tariff. Now, that's a pretty extraordinary use of federal power, but Jackson was able to do it because he felt that it was a very important precedent to set for the nation. And Jackson's also interesting because he favors executive power overall, so he might look more kindly on a governor because he sees them more like a fellow president rather than the judiciary or Congress. And Jackson's expansion of power is actually what really sets the stage for Lincoln to be able to do a lot of the stuff that he does just a few decades later.
Yeah, and of course, it's again South Carolina, like leading the rebellion. It's the first state to secede. That's the beginning of the American Civil War. So yeah, Abraham Lincoln kind of had to take more power. We've said this in previous programs. It's no surprise, but specifically, how did Lincoln shift the power from the states to the federal government during the war?
So Lincoln shifted power from the states to the federal government significantly. Wartime often sees presidents expand their powers significantly, and it very rarely goes back after that. When Abraham Lincoln is elected president, as I'm sure all of you know, the southern states decided to secede from the Union over the question of slavery. Now, Lincoln didn't favor abolishing slavery necessarily. He just wanted to limit its expansion into the western territories. So Lincoln actually says, hey guys, even if I wanted to abolish slavery, I couldn't because the president doesn't have that power. The president doesn't have the power to take away the property of his citizens, and that's what slaves were at the time, unfortunately. And you can see Lincoln's changing opinions on this over the course of the war. You can see even in his speeches, he goes from talking about our country as a union of disparate rival states, as you mentioned earlier, to later on talking about it as a nation, which goes into that whole idea of the forming of our national identity. And it's really interesting to look at the Civil War not only as the Civil War itself, but as a sort of second American Revolution, where we reckoned with a lot of the things that were unaddressed in our founding, right? It was this birth of a new country, a more unified country. And you see Lincoln sort of expanding powers in other ways as well that we don't look on as kindly. Of course, he ignores habeas corpus, and he starts jailing innocent people and journalists who, without any due process, whose only crime was speaking out against him, which is an extraordinary abuse of power, and it's something that we kind of overlook in Lincoln's legacy very often. But I think that Lincoln had this sort of attitude that I'm working to save my country, and it's okay if I bend the law a little bit to do so. And he was actually very, very Jacksonian in that way, which is funny because you don't see those two compared very often. But his time was just such a significant changing for America. You think about the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad as well. Our nation becomes a lot more accessible from one part of it to another. You think about conscription. That was the first time that a president ever raised a national army instead of just using state militias, which was a significant contributor to the formation of a national identity and making young men come and fight in war instead of just having them volunteer. It was a significant departure from previous presidents.
Yeah. Technology is a weird thing that we probably should bring it up because that's another reason why the federal government, I think, gained power over state governments because we just kind of naturally became more connected as technology progressed. You had the telegraph, the railroads, and later communication developments. I mean, today, the whole world is connected via the internet. You can make a best friend in Malaysia just like that, and I think that's been a big contributor to the rise of internationalism and globalism, but that's a little bit of a tangent. So anyway, that's something to keep in the back of your mind. Let's jump ahead now. On the screen, you see one of our favorite presidents as well, Theodore Roosevelt, as the nickname Teddy, which he hated. But in my view, Teddy Roosevelt signed these two progressive era laws that I think dramatically changed American federalism. And that's the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act, which, of course, created the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration. So how did those two laws in particular push the limits of interstate commerce?
So the Meat Inspection Act, what that did was it created it gave the USDA, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, the ability to inspect livestock and meat that was being sold for cleanliness or for disease. This was already an extraordinary expansion of power through the Commerce Clause, because the Commerce Clause, what it was supposed to be was a way to monitor interstate trade, right? Trade between the states. But now the states were becoming so interconnected that you couldn't really just focus on that. You had to focus on things that were originally outside of its scope, such as production. So you had to look at how agriculture was being made. You had to look at how factories were making their products. And then with the Clean Food and Drug Act, that established the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration. And what that did is that it gave the federal government the power for the first time to really look at the food that Americans were consuming. It made it so that companies and farmers, producers had to include labels with the contents of whatever they were selling on it, which previously hadn't been a thing. So now if you had a snake oil salesman, they would have to tell you exactly what was in their supposed miracle drug, and that was a really big departure from...
There was literal snake oil salesmen. That was a literal thing, by the way.
Yeah, and it's funny because Theodore Roosevelt, we think of him as this interventionist when it comes to foreign policy, but really he was an interventionist in domestic policy as well. His daughter Alice had a famous quote that was, "My father had to be the bride at every wedding and the corpse at every funeral." He really liked being a center of attention, and he wanted to be that center of attention in people's daily lives as well. That's the first time that you really see the president making an effort to be known and loved by all the American people and felt throughout the nation in a way that no other president had been. And the Commerce Clause, again, is just so vital to the expansion of federal power, because it's through that the federal government really starts being able to just control what's going on, not only between the states, but inside the states that impact all of the other states as well.
Yeah, I mean, before that, each state had their own set of regulations. Many states didn't have very many regulations. And we're going to talk about labor here later with the New Deal as a continuation of the progressive era. But also the impact of the jungle. Like, we think about certain books in American history. That's one of them, like Upton Sinclair's novel, The Jungle, which Theodore Roosevelt read, and some historians say that heavily influenced his decision to sign the Meat Inspection Act. Do you think that, I mean, it's really about consumer protection. That book was not supposed to be about consumer protection. It was supposed to be a socialist book, like promoting socialism, by the way. But yeah, like, do you think that's why these laws ended up being, like, Americans were okay with it? Because they're like, oh, that's disgusting, that's going on? Do you think that's really, why do you think, like, what's the Jungle, how big of a factor was that book?
Well, The Jungle was really, really influential in American life more broadly, but especially in the life of Theodore Roosevelt. I don't think that without that book you see him pursuing those policies as much as he did. You know, we talk about Theodore Roosevelt as being this very hyperactive president trying to get all these things done. His attention was very divided, but that really became a priority of his. And it's funny because if you look at the contemporary accounts, there's lots of people, well, especially from the socialist flank of politics, that thought that Roosevelt didn't go far enough, that he was being far too moderate in his politics. And that really goes to show just how political eras go, like during the progressive era, Theodore Roosevelt's time, politicians from across the aisle, Republican and Democrat, were pursuing progressive change. You see that also with Woodrow Wilson, who was Democrat, famously ran against Theodore Roosevelt as well. So it shows you how much the era that a politician is from, regardless of that politician's specific ideology, can impact the decisions that they make.
And despite this increase of federal intervention in economic activities, dual federalism still kind of dominated. And I argue that changed. Again, dual federalism is the idea that you just kind of split the powers. Like state powers have these states have certain powers, the federal government has certain powers, it's kind of split. But then comes along Franklin Roosevelt, who's also up there on the screen, and his New Deal. And then we have cooperative federalism, or the idea that the federal government can have much more power directing what states must do. Yeah, it starts, now we're starting talking about, okay, we have the money, what you gonna do? So yeah, let's talk about FDR. So could you explain why cooperative federalism became to be the dominant form of federalism?
Yeah, so under dual federalism, there was this idea that state and federal government were two very distinct entities, right? They had their own separate centers of power that didn't often intersect with each other. Now, as the country became larger and more interconnected, as we've been talking about, those lines started to blur a little bit, and they started interacting with each other. Now, this had started long before Franklin Roosevelt became president, during the late 19th century and early 20th century, especially with Theodore Roosevelt that we just spoke about. Those lines already started to integrate a lot more. But the New Deal was really the straw that broke the camel's back. As we said previously, states are the primary actors in charge of the welfare of its citizens. But after the economic crash, they really just didn't have the resources to provide for their needs. So Franklin Roosevelt, what he does when he assumes the presidency is that he decides that the president is going to be even more present in people's daily lives, that he is going to provide the states with the resources that they need. Franklin Roosevelt pursues things like the WPA, for example, the Work Progress Administration, which seeks to give jobs to American citizens who were out of work through big government projects. You also have Social Security, which is established by Franklin Roosevelt around the time of the New Deal as well, which has an extraordinary effect in lifting people out of poverty at the time. So you see the federal government let the states make their own decisions for the most part, but give them directives on what to do, give them aid, give them funding, and then let them implement that in their own ways. And that's really what dual federalism is. It's the federal government and the state governments working together. But you'll see as time went on, the federal government became more and more influential as it grew bigger and bigger. And that really starts with Franklin Roosevelt. He's really our first modern president in the sense of the word that we understand it today.
Yeah, state governments just being so dependent on federal money in particular, I think that's just a fascinating shift. And we could also mention all the labor rules that were put in place at the federal level. Like, they had minimum wage laws in different states going back to, I would say, 40, 50 years before the New Deal. But now there's a federal minimum wage. Flash forward to today, Kansas is like one of 10 states, I think, that has the federal minimum wage, and then all the other states have raised their minimum wage, by the way. But, cost of living is different in different states. So it's cheaper to live here, so okay, whatever. But and then we talk about, I think another big thing we didn't mention is the idea of the weekend, not the rapper. I know some of you were thinking, or the singer, not the singer. The week, Saturday and Sunday. You may have heard of it. That wasn't a thing before the New Deal. The 5-day work week wasn't a thing. Think about that. So anyway, federal government stepping in and saying every single state has to you pay them overtime if they're working more than 40 hours a week. What do you think that impact on labor in particular, in terms of state governments and federal governments?
God, it is really difficult to overstate the impact of that. I think that especially because following that, following the 1940s and World War II, you start to get the modern picture of American life that we have today, right? The sort of romanticized image of the nuclear family and the dad who goes to work and everything. And I don't think that would have been possible at all without the labor progress of the 1930s. I think that we really underestimate the amount that America shifted so rapidly during the early 20th century. I think that the Great Depression and World War II in sequence from one to another was such a rapid backlash that we saw the country go from this very difficult, precarious position where people had no support from the federal government in that way to a much more robust federal government that comes not only as a result of Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal policies, but also as a result of our position on the world stage following World War II, right? We become the dominant superpower on the planet. And there you see the quality of life for Americans just improve significantly. Our economic outlooks and everything just went up by so much.
And the last president up there on the screen is, of course, Lyndon Baines Johnson, LBJ, president in the 60s. I would argue the last decade where we did see a lot of dramatic legislation pushed through, and in many ways the continuation of the New Deal. So yeah, how did LBJ further shift the power from the states to the federal government? You know a lot about LBJ, I know.
Yeah, Johnson's the most interesting president, if you ask me. But earlier we talked a bit about the progressive era, how during that time presidents from the Democratic Party and the Republican Party kind of acted towards a similar ideology. So after the Great Depression and the New Deal, you see what we call today the New Deal order, where Republicans and Democrats were both New Dealers for the most part, right? So following Roosevelt, you have Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, these people that no matter what side of the aisle they were on, they favor big government intervention in people's daily lives. But Lyndon Johnson is the biggest carrier of Franklin Roosevelt's legacy out of any of these men. Lyndon Johnson comes into office and he decides that the welfare of every American citizen is going to be his responsibility. He wants to lift up the poor, the minorities, everybody from every facet of American life. So he comes in and he does the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, which are two of the most important pieces of legislation in American history. And in doing so, in passing those anti-segregation laws, he takes away state autonomy to discriminate against people based on the color of their skin, right? And this was already a huge issue going back to the Civil War, the whole idea of states' rights that had been part of the Democratic Party platform for such a long time. So for a Democratic president, of all people, to come in and to pass civil rights legislation, knowing the effect that that was going to have on the party, and in doing so, drastically expanding the power of the federal government over local counties, local cities, over what I know bathroom policy was a big thing, right? Like blacks only bathrooms, whites only bathrooms. To tell a mayor that he couldn't do that in his own town was a very significant expansion of federal power. With Johnson, you also get other legislation that's similar to Roosevelt, like Medicaid or Head Start, just these big government programs that were going to be implemented with the help of the states. So I think more than any president since, Lyndon Johnson really made that effort to make the presidency present in local communities. And I think that Franklin Roosevelt and Johnson, to a lesser extent, kind of set an unrealistic standard for what a president could do, you know.
And then there was a backlash. And I argue that today, we've been kind of, even ever since the 60s, you could go back to the 1960s and say that we are still in this kind of reactionary era of politics dominated by what they call new federalism. So this was something I mentioned before. It's the idea that you want to shift the power back to the states, kind of a return to how it was in the early years of the Republic. And so I would say the Reagan Revolution is something that's often brought up, but we can even go back to Richard Nixon. So how did both Ronald Reagan and Richard Nixon influence this change?
Yeah, so it is impossible to talk about new federalism without talking about the social backlash to civil rights that you mentioned. Following the Civil War, the Democratic Party had solid control of the 11 former Confederate states for nearly the entire 80-year period up until the Civil Rights Act of 1965. By passing the Civil Rights Act, the Democratic Party really sort of put those voters up for grabs in a way that they previously hadn't been for almost a century, right? So the Republican Party, it's really quite opportunistic what they do. They come in, and Nixon, who had previously been a very strong supporter of civil rights in 1960 when he ran for president, comes in sort of virtue signaling, talking about states' rights, which we all know what states' rights mean in that context,
Coded, yes.
And talking about the silent majority and really appealing to like Southern white voters in particular that still had those racial sentiments from the previous era. And I think that's impossible to disregard when talking about that. You see the parties switch, and the Republican Party starts having very strong control over the South. And I think that this went back and forth a little bit in the following years. You had Jimmy Carter winning some Southern states, of course, as a Southerner himself. But I think by the time you get to Ronald Reagan, that switch really becomes finalized, and we lock into the political paradigms that we have today. And Reagan's funny because he was also someone who was talking very much about states' rights, but he expanded the power of the federal government in a lot of ways himself with the military budget. So,
yeah. Although Reagan, and you pointed this out to me, like right after the founding of the Department of Education, which was like 1980 or 1979, somewhere along then, Reagan was like, we need to abolish the Department of Education. So he was saying this stuff. And another organization I just have to mention is the Heritage Foundation. I think we mentioned it on the first program briefly, but huge influence in the 1970s, 1980s, and this whole new federalism movement, I think, which is continuing today. You look at people of influence in the current administration, many of them were raised on the tenets of the Heritage Foundation. So if you don't know what the Heritage Foundation is, just search it up. There's a lot out there about them. So yeah, let's take it to today. How are states today? I guess before we get to I know everybody wants to see him back on the screen. There he is. Before we get to what's going on today, but this actually started, I would say, we can go back like 20 years. How are states today continuing to rebel against the president?
Yeah, so states are continuing to rebel against the presidency in a couple very important ways. I think the most notable of these is drug policy for our contemporary conversations. Like we mentioned earlier, the Supremacy Clause says that the federal government, their laws cannot be contradicted by the states. When they do contradict, the federal government, their laws take precedence. But we started seeing states have their own laws when it comes to drugs, right? Like we have recreational marijuana being legal in various states now in the U.S. In theory, someone who has a marijuana dispensary in California could be locked up on federal drug charges. There's nothing that necessarily stops the federal government from doing that. But what we talked about earlier was the idea of implementation and resources, right? Is the federal government really going to send the DEA to go lock up some person selling marijuana in California legally because it contradicts federal law? Do they have the resources to do that? Can they really do that without the assistance of the state governors? That's a really big question there.
Yeah, I mean, Oregon not only has legalized cannabis, but they've also decriminalized pretty much all drugs that are listed in the Controlled Substances Act. And so enforcement, I think, is a big key to it too. Like most states these days, even in Kansas, like it's decriminalized to a certain extent compared to how it was. We could also talk about, there's education policy. What about that? Like how, if you go to Missouri, just 30 minutes away, it's going to look different in a classroom than it is here in town, here in Kansas. So what about how are different states teaching things differently?
Yeah, so as we mentioned previously, schools are under the purview of state governments. Of course, they receive significant federal funding, which can make them go one way or another on a matter of decisions. I know recently there's been conversations about what books are appropriate for schools, and that has been a very heated discussion, and that's policy that you can see very much on a state-by-state basis. So what happens here is that, let's say, for example, the president has a specific policy that the president has a specific policy that he wants to pursue. Nothing stops a state governor from having a completely contradictory policy platform to pursue that's just different from what the president wants. So they can have two opposing tracks at the same time. So we could have an education program in Kansas that's completely contrary to the president's initiative on education federally, and have those things not really come into conflict that much.
That all said, still every state's heavily dependent on the federal government for funding. I mean, that's really what it comes down to. So states can rebel, I think, only to a certain extent still. I think it's a little bit overplayed. Before I ask this last part of this, I want to remind those watching on the live stream, if you have a question for us during the Q&A, which we'll start here shortly, you can email us at dolequestions@ku.edu. dolequestions@ku.edu. And a reminder to the audience, if you have a question in mind, especially about what's going on right now, we'll be opening it up to you shortly. So specifically, let's talk about immigration. Like how, I know when you told me that 22 states filed lawsuits against Trump's order to end birthright citizenship. There's another example of states rebelling. Because, that's been pretty controversial. But talk about like immigration enforcement. How has that been a way states can rebel?
Yeah, so immigration enforcement is a very big one in particular because you have states that are border states, right? You have states where that's going to be a lot more impactful. And as we mentioned before, as much as the federal government might have its agencies like Border Patrol, for example, they can't necessarily get that much done without local resources. So let's say if California has immigration policy that's contrary to the current administration's, they don't necessarily need to aid the administration's efforts to cut down on border crossings, for example. Or even in Texas, I think towards the end of the Biden administration, you saw Governor Abbott busing immigrants from Texas up to blue states in the northern parts of the United States to just ship off some of its undocumented populations, and that was something that the federal government just wasn't really able to do anything about other than lawsuits because that was under the purview of the governor.
And sanctuary cities, sanctuary counties, sanctuary states, what is that? For those who don't know what that means, what does that mean?
So a sanctuary city basically just means that an undocumented person within those borders is just given a lot more purview. They are protected from deportation for the most part in there. They're able to do a lot more things just generally without having to worry about their safety in that regard.
Yes. Okay. So that about wraps up the presentation here. But now we're going to open it up to Q&A. But if we can give another round of applause for André, because I think he did a wonderful job.
Thank you, guys.
He's a youngin', and he just did that. I'm impressed. Okay, so if you have a question, just a reminder, just raise your hand. They'll come over with a microphone. One of our student advisory board members will be right over to you.
So you both mentioned litigation, lawsuits, as in the like toolbox for states to dissent against the federal government. But when states sue the federal government, doesn't that happen in federal court, and aren't federal courts part of the federal government? And like, how does that affect it? There seems to be some the puzzle pieces aren't fitting.
That's a good, I mean, a judge is supposed to be a third party. It's not supposed to be, sure, they're part of the federal government, but when you walk in a courtroom, that's not supposed to be a political situation. It's supposed to be an independent, third party situation. So I think that's the idea. if you look at most of these cases, actually, like, I don't know if there's, I haven't looked at every single case where you have a state suing the federal government, or you have basically a battle between states and the federal government. I would say, just guessing, I think it's kind of gone both ways. I don't necessarily think there's one trend one way or the other. I mentioned that West Virginia case from a couple years ago versus the EPA. West Virginia won that one. Yeah, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I would argue that the states impact the federal government in other ways as well. If you look at Congress, for example, senators represent specific states, congressmen represent specific states. So through that argument, you could say that the states have a part in making the laws of the country. And so as far as going up to the judiciary, like you said, it is an independent body of government, and that's
supposed
just,
to be.
Yeah, that's just the checks that we have on the system. But I appreciate that line of thinking. I hadn't thought about it like that.
All right.
I would appreciate your opinions about how much faith we should have in the states being able to protect their rights and powers from being attacked by the presidency, and how much faith should we have in the Supreme Court to be able to protect the states' rights and powers.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we touched on it a bit here, but with the federal government's funding of states becoming more and more important to the state's well-being, that is a genuine worry, right? The president can threaten to withhold funding from a state if there's a disagreement on a certain policy platform, and that is a genuine concern of state sovereignty. And I think that that is a consequence of the interconnected nature of our country today. But I think that's also part of why our country has been so strong, right? Is that throughout the course of our history, at times when the federal government has needed to, it has stepped in and pushed the states in the direction that it had to go, whether that be in terms of regulating the meatpacking industry or whether that be with civil rights. I think that it can go both ways. There can be a danger of the federal government overreaching, but at times the federal government can also bring a sort of justice for its citizens in a way.
I think that some states are incredibly powerful, and the rest of the country depends heavily on them. Of course, California immediately comes to mind, Texas as well, but so kind of the way they go is the way the rest of the country goes. And also, you have coalitions that form between state governments, and especially governors talk to each other. So I've seen already Washington, Oregon, and California, collectively known as the left coast, I think I've heard that term. They just quickly get on board with the same things all the time. And that's a lot of, I mean, if you just want to look at GDP alone, those three states, there's a lot of money coming out of those three states. And I think, and you know, we're here in Kansas, which is one of the smallest states in the union. It's frustrating, especially living in a place like this, but always the saving grace for a small state like Kansas is the Senate and the Electoral College. So I think that's kind of why we don't mind, but the fact of the matter is, we can't really think of the 50 states as like being truly equal when really there's just a handful of states that the rest of the country depends on. So I think that's a good way to fight back is what I'm trying to say if they disagree with the federal government. Yeah.
My question is about citizens that live in territories like the Virgin Islands, Puerto Rico, Samoa, Guam, or the Native American reservations. What rights do they have under federalism?
Well, the Supreme Court has ruled on this a little bit, and they actually, like Native Americans especially, they have unique rights, separate sovereignty, separate from, they are first and foremost citizens of their tribal nation versus being American citizens, but they do have dual citizenship. The territories is a little bit less optimistic. I mean, unfortunately, a lot of people, they can't even vote in the U.S. territories. That's a I know American Samoa is even weirder because they're U.S. nationals there, so that's another dynamic. They have so they have some privileges, but not all of them. So yeah, did that answer your question? Kind of. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean that's a really interesting question, and I think that's one of the contradictions of our country, right? Is taxation without representation was such a large part of our founding, and yet we have these citizens who, if they moved to the continental United States, could enjoy the full rights of citizenship, but whether they're in Puerto Rico, or Guam, or any other territory, they just can't exercise that fully. And I know those conversations come up very often as well because those territories have a very high percentage of military, like they have a lot of enlisted members. So
Yep.
those are people that are fighting for their countries, or for their country, and very often don't get to exercise the full rights of that citizenship. So I think that's something that we could definitely address better as a country.
We haven't talked at all about the power of states over the election system, and I haven't had a chance to look into this very much, but I read a couple of sentences today about the president's plan to require a proof of citizenship for everyone voting in federal elections, and perhaps a standard that would even require people to have a passport in order to register for federal elections, and perhaps have a dual system for people who have one requirement to vote in state elections and another requirement to vote in federal elections. I just wondered what you thought about that.
I can't believe we forgot to bring up elections. Thanks so much for
Yeah.
bringing that up. That's a big one.
That
States run elections. So, like, I can go off on a tangent on this because, like, remember back in 2020, all the election deniers were just like, "There's this big federal conspiracy." What are you talking about? Like, not just every state runs their own elections. Every county, every precinct, it goes down. I mean, this is about as local as it can get. And yeah, I think that's a beautiful system. Unfortunately, as you brought up, there are some that are abusing that power at the local and state levels with ID laws, and which, that's less controversial, but passports? I had not heard about the passports. Oh, I had not heard about that. Okay. Okay. Oh, yeah. Well, okay. So yeah, like I do think one thing I will say, and I'll let you talk. I know you got something to say on this too. But like in terms of, there's a lot of folks that don't realize that voter suppression has been a big issue over the last 10 years, especially since the Shelby County v. Holder decision, the Supreme Court decision that stripped a lot of the Voting Rights Act away. So you see states that are, oh yeah, we're doing everything by the book, it's legal. But when you're shutting down polling locations and you're making them, you're requiring someone to show an ID to vote, even though a lot of people don't have IDs. These are actually indirect ways of suppressing the vote, and yeah, indiscriminately affecting people of color. So yeah, like this is something I hope keeps being brought up. It can go the opposite way, like there's states like, I'm bringing up Oregon again. Oregon has a law where you're just automatically registered. You don't have to, like when you pay your taxes or something, I don't know the exact part of it, but it's just, it's easy. And then like some states make it easier to vote by mail or vote early. So I think if more states kind of go that direction, I think that would be a great way to fight back.
Yeah. It's funny because I'm originally from Brazil, and whenever I talk to family members from there, they are completely dumbfounded by our electoral system, right? Like their presidency is decided by the popular vote, and it's done right on a machine, and they have the results within like 2 hours of polling from when polls close, and that's just it. And whenever I talk to my family members, I have to tell them, no, we run 50 individual elections here, plus DC. Don't forget DC. And that's just, it is a very beautiful symbol of our federalism, right? Of us being 50 states that come together and form a nation. And I think it can be a little messy at times, right? Like you have those differing laws by states, and during the pandemic, there was so much controversy about vote by mail. And I'm from Florida. You guys all remember the hanging Chad situation from 2020 and all the
Or 2000?
Or yeah, from 2000
Yeah,
and
Bush
all
v.
the all the confusion that caused. You know, I think that it's something that's a little messy, but I think that it's an overall positive to address the concerns of each state's citizens better.
How many questions can we take? Yeah, this is fun.
Yeah.
Well, this has just been fascinating, and thank you so much. Talk a little bit about Theodore Roosevelt forming the Bull Moose Party when he couldn't get reelected, and tell us if you think that could happen in the next couple of years.
Oh man.
Oh, if you didn't hear the question, they asked if a strong third-party movement would be viable in the next, couple of elections. I would have said 2016 would have been a perfect opportunity, but it just seemed like the third parties couldn't get their act together then. But the thing about the Bull, she specifically mentioned the Bull Moose Party. That was the progressive, also known as the Progressive Party. That was the party that Theodore Roosevelt started after he didn't get the nomination for the Republican Party in 1912, and so him and his supporters famously stormed out of the Republican convention, and they're like, we're going to start our own party. If you got to have a larger-than-life, really huge star, I think, for that to happen again. And who is that today? I mean, I guess there's a couple candidates, I guess, but.
Yeah, I mean, what's really singular about the Bull Moose example is that Theodore Roosevelt had served as president for 2 terms. He was a very popular president, and up to that point, it wasn't illegal for a president to run for a 3rd term yet. So in theory, he could have if he wanted to, but he didn't want to break the precedent set by Washington. So Taft, his hand-picked successor, goes into the presidency, and throughout his time in office, Roosevelt's really unsatisfied. He feels like he's insufficiently progressive, and he's not being the fighter that Roosevelt feels should be in the office. So Roosevelt decides to run again for a 3rd party against his hand-picked successor, or he primaries Taft. In the Republican Party, and I don't remember exactly, but wasn't there something at the convention, some chicanery there?
Yeah, It was very dramatic.
Yeah. Roosevelt likely would have won without some interference, but Roosevelt, he then decides to run a 3rd party campaign. So the overperformance of the Bull Moose Party has to be considered as being a former president running a 3rd party campaign, right? I think that the closest we could have gotten is if in this election cycle Trump had lost the primary. I think he probably would have run a 3rd party campaign against someone like a DeSantis, but I really don't see a likelihood of something like that going forward. But I think Trump really could have been the one.
I mean, you're seeing factions within the Democratic Party. Like I'm noticing there's a very clear divide with like the more progressive wing of the Democratic Party and the more, for lack of a better word, traditional Democrat. So, yeah.
I'm going to have to apologize in advance because this is a bit of a long one, but if you look at the presidents who really expanded federal power, like Lincoln and FDR in particular, you might think at first glance that those things happened during times of national crisis. But if you go a little deeper, look at LBJ, that happened in a time when the economy is really good. And if you look at it, he justified it that way, say, why not expand the federal government at a time when we have so much money to pay for it effectively? So maybe it is a little more nuanced when these things happen, dare I say unpredictable. Do you maybe have any predictions for in the future what potential events could cause expansions or contractions of federal power?
Of course I do. You go first.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you have a valid point there, but I do think it's also important to consider the effect that the Kennedy assassination had on the country, right? I think that there was a sort of confluence confluence of events where you get JFK dying in a very, very traumatic way that impacts the public greatly. That happens around the time that there's all this turmoil in the country over civil rights. That's been a question that's been looming larger and larger over time. And you get Lyndon Johnson, who is really singularly able to harness that moment with his Senate experience as majority leader. JFK was the one who originally wanted to pass the civil rights bill, but JFK would call the senators and he'd be like, hey, please vote for my bill. And they'd say, oh, no, I can't because my constituents and this and that. And JFK would say, I understand. Okay, thank you. LBJ wouldn't understand. LBJ would bully people. Yeah, like he would bully people, get up in their personal space, threaten them with federal funding, as we've been talking about, do all these things to force them to vote along with him. So I think that it's really the sort of this perfect storm of the tragedy of the Kennedy assassination, with it also being a time that the United States was prospering a lot and wanted to put that towards a shared goal, and with Lyndon Johnson's own personal expertise.
Yeah, that explains it really well. So as far as predictions, all right. No, I think the pendulum just always goes back and forth. And the fact of the matter is, and I think this is something that a lot of people haven't come to terms with, is that the pendulum has went pretty far right in recent years. I mean, we have somebody like Barack Obama, who's supposed to be this Marxist socialist. The dude was further right than Richard Nixon was, in terms of economic policy, not social policies, but economic policies. And when I say that, some of you are like, what? No, that's not right. Look, trust me on this.
Nixon established the EPA.
What I'm trying to say is the pendulum has been over here. It's ultimately going to go back. And I think a lot of people, it's going to catch people by surprise. And it's going to be dramatic. And yeah, I mean, it's probably going to take a natural, probably something like a major recession again, or some event like that.
Yeah, just to add on to the predictions a little bit, we talked earlier about the progressive era, the New Deal order that really comes to an end around the time of Richard Nixon. Around the time of Reagan, you see the rise of the neoliberal order, the one that we're in at the moment. Our current political paradigms, we don't know exactly what comes next, but it's very likely that things are shifting, right? You see demographics changing as far as voters go. You see
populism on the rise in the Republican Party.
Yeah,
That's
even the Republican Party doing better among minorities as well is a huge thing. You see those coalitions shifting a little bit, and that's something that could take our politics in completely unfounded directions. I think that we've been under our current political paradigm for a very long time, and it's hard to tell what comes next. I don't think you could have really predicted Trump and the rise of populism on the right, just knowing that the Republican Party would be completely co-opted and transformed into something very different from what it was before that. So it's kind of exciting not to know, I guess.
But history can help you predict.
Yes.
Hi. Just to piggyback off her question on voting, with Trump's desire to take the voting to a national level, basically, with his desire for the control of it. Something I don't think that the Founding Fathers saw was the states where the Secretary of State and the Attorney Generals, once they become compliant with an authoritarian president, that he literally then does have control of the election system in each state, because they will do whatever he asks them to do to send the control back to the federal government. So if you can speak on that a little bit, if they ever think they ever saw that somewhere down in the future.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about specifically the electoral vote certification and stuff like that.
And just the voter rolls, because he's wanting the voter rolls turned over to the federal government.
Yeah, in case you didn't hear him, he said voter rolls. I don't know much about that specifically, but I will say that there's always the courts that will step in, and I think a lot of times they have really done a good job. I know the Supreme Court is not very popular right now, but I still stick up for them often because stuff like that. I mean, if there's a state attorney general that wants to go rogue, but then like a bunch of them start to go rogue, that is terrifying. But at the same time, it's just there is a judicial process that I think we can still rely on.
Yeah. I think what you brought up was super relevant because so much of what we talked about today was about the president and the federal government being able to really kind of bully the states and compel them to act a certain way by threatening to withhold funding or in some extreme cases raising troops, So it's a valid question. It's a valid concern. I understand where you're coming from with that. I think our system has held for a pretty long time, right? We kind of tend to rely on that, but it is scary to think about. And the best thing that we can do is really be good constituents, right? Like talk to your congressman, talk to your senator. If you see something that you feel is contrary to your local interests as a voter from whatever state you are from, you've got to make your voice heard. And that's the point of state government, is that it is supposed to be more so the voice of the people than the federal.
Maybe time for one more. Is that okay? I think someone up here had one. Did you still have a question?
Well, I was just going to say that.
Oh, yeah, we can get you a microphone.
I was just going to, I believe the gentleman already mentioned this, but there was, I believe it was an executive order yesterday or this morning, it's hard to keep track, demanding that the electoral rolls from all states be submitted to Elon Musk. So that is extremely worrisome.
Yeah, that is worrisome.
I mean, who controls, for example, I'm thinking, all right, who is it in our state who would or would not send those rolls, and so on and so forth, from state to state. So it is exactly that whole question of federal versus state really coming to a head, I think. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, that's executive order doesn't, I mean, it's not a law. Mm-hmm. If it was a law, I'd be more concerned. A lot of these executive orders, you'll notice they're not really, I think it's more like publicity, like he's just trying to like, hey, I'm going to rename the Gulf of Mexico. I just think that we need to remember, we said this in the second program with Heimler, in case you were here. If you were here, thank you for coming back. But we mentioned that, executive orders are not the same thing as laws. And so a lot of these, I think we need to like have constraint, not worry too much, because it has to be Congress. And if it's not Congress, then we're no longer a republic. Then there's bigger things to worry about.
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes back to what we were saying about even with executive orders, states can sue the federal government. They can bring about those lawsuits. They can choose not to implement those policies, right? You can always refuse to comply. I'd be curious to see how many states actually end up sending their voter rolls in, if that's the case, and if they don't, what the federal government could actually do about it. It ends up being. Sometimes that could be actually a fairly simple resolution to that, and it can end up being, like Matt said, more of a publicity stunt.
Yeah. Gosh, I hate to end it on that one, but we are. But I guess I have a segue for the final program of this series, which this whole series, again, we're just looking at how the power of the president is limited. So the final program will be in 2 weeks from today. That's April 9th, same time, 4 p.m. right here. And you can also go to the live stream if you can't make it in person. But we will be featuring 2 guests. So that's exciting. And we're going to look specifically at how we can limit the power of the president. Heck yeah. Yeah, we matter too. We're the voters. How can the voters limit the power of the president? And I'm particularly excited about this program because we're actually going to be looking at tangible reforms that activists have been promoting for a few years now, and you're seeing it already at state and local levels of things like approval voting and ranked choice voting and proposals to expand the size of the House of Representatives. So I'm excited to talk to my colleagues Walter Clapp and Sarah Wolk. So if you can join me for that in 2 weeks. But otherwise, thanks again, André.
Oh, thank you.
And thanks to all of you for being here.
Thank you guys for coming out.
You. Have a good night.